right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Makena Ireri, and I will be your moderator today on this webinar on securing an inclusive energy transition, thinking about female empowerment and entrepreneurship in energy access. So this webinar is organized by the Efficiency for Access Coalition. I'm going to walk you through the agenda, tell you a bit more about the coalition, and then set the scene for this topic. Then later on, I'll introduce our speakers who will go through some presentation, and there will be time at the end for question and answer session through the audience, as well as a small panel session moderated by myself. Next, please. So here's our agenda today. A small welcome and setting the scene. Then we have presentations from Energia, GOGLA, and Value for Women. After which we'll have a small session moderated by myself with a couple of questions and some discussion. We'll then open it up to the audience for Q&A. And we have a little ask of you at the end in our conclusion where we also share resources. Next, please. So a little bit about the Efficiency for Access Coalition. It's a global coalition whose main aim really is to promote high-performing appliances that enable access to clean energy. And that is directed to the world's poorest. We really hope to be a catalyst for change. We want to accelerate the growth of the off-grid appliance market so that we can boost incomes, reduce carbon emissions, and improve quality of life. The coalition is made up of 15 donor roundtable members. That's the orange box at the top there. 10 program partners. You can see those in the green box. That's not the totality of them, just a selection. And then we have more than 30 investor network members. And our current membership has programs and initiatives spanning 44 countries, 22 technologies, and the co-secretariat is CLASP and the Energy Saving Trust. Next, please. So one of the things we do as a coalition is collaborate to enhance impact of programs, and one such collaboration is the Appliances Empower campaign. So we all understand really that women are disproportionately, have a massive disproportionate share in energy poverty and the burden of energy poverty around the world, especially in terms of expected time and heavy burden, the intense activities that go around women's activities. So greater energy access and energy efficient appliances can really improve women's health, well-being, social and economic status. And we see that the Sustainable Development Goal 7 and Goal 5, gender equality, are really inextricably linked. Achieving one goal will definitely advance the other. And so to raise awareness about the need to include women in the global energy transition, we launched the Appliances Empower campaign. It's a global campaign to strengthen linkages between energy access, gender equity, and social inclusion. It was launched in November, and the campaign really centers women in the conversation about global energy access by detailing the role that high-performing energy efficiency appliances play in achieving both SDGs 7 and 5. And so if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about how these dots connect. So connecting the dots around SDG 5 and 7 is really the idea thinking about how modern energy enables economic advancement, not just of women, but of people. But specifically because of the heavy burden that women share, then they also are disproportionately have potential to get disproportionately more impact from connecting these two. So in terms of exploring this connection, we want to make sure that we understand that we're defining modern energy access as reliable and affordable, and we're defining economic empowerment as women having the ability to succeed and advance economically, and the power to make and act on economic decisions. So there are multiple pathways towards empowerment, taking those definitions, pathways that reduce drudgery, that save time, that improve baseline condition of women, and even direct employment in energy value chains. Next, please. So here, just to set the scene a little bit, some of the research has been lately published shows a stark difference in energy needs and benefits by gender. So for example, in a co-published report we did with 60 decibels, we found that men often are responsible for income generating activities in the home that are related to their solar TV. And that's 84% men versus 16% women. Another example we have found in our research is that although many firms have that significant commitment towards inclusivity, most of their customers are men. So in 60% of households that 60 decibels surveyed, they found that the man was the one to first hear about the product, and also the man was the one who made the decision to purchase. And also down on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the priorities from a female and a male perspective are quite different in terms of the appliances that matter to them and the appliances that they feel would deliver the most impact to them. And so really the idea here is to explore how can we, using appliances, but also using kind of other programs, pathways, initiatives that that we have in the energy access space and that our panelists will speak on, how can we really bridge some of these gaps that we're seeing? Next, please. So please allow me to introduce you now to our panelists and speakers. So as I said, I'm Makena, I'm a manager at CLASP. We are Co-Secretariat of Efficiency for Access. Today we'll also hear from Susie Wheeldon. She's a lead researcher at GOGLA. Within GOGLA, Susie's work includes the multi-country, multi-company powering opportunities impact series. And prior to GOGLA, she also worked at Power for All, was campaign manager at Solar Aid, and has spent nearly 12 years in the finance sector. Fun fact also, Susie once cycled 13,500 miles to promote the potential for solar energy. That's really interesting. Next, we have Joy Clancy. Joy is a member of the Department of Governance and Technology for Sustainability at the University of Twente, where she's also a professor of development studies, specializing in gender and energy. She has a PhD in engineering, and her research really focuses for more than 30 years on small-scale energy systems for developing countries, how technology transfer is done, and the role that energy plays in small businesses, particularly for women. Then next we have Stephanie Finigan. Stephanie is the manager of operation at Value for Women, and she's been there since 2017. She's led the team in design, implementation, and evaluation of gender inclusive business strategy, both for a variety of investors, but also for development institutions. And her expertise is focusing on developing practical market-based solutions for gender inclusion, with an emphasis really on women economic empowerment. So I think you can agree with me, this is a fantastic panel. And without further ado, we'd love to just get in there and hear from them. I'll hand it over to Joy.
Right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm going to talk about women's economic empowerment and entrepreneurship in linked to energy access. I'm particularly looking at what the evidence is. So can I have the first slide, please? I'm going to quickly say something about Energia, and then talk about two aspects of the work that Energia has been doing related to gathering evidence on these particular issues. So first I'm going to say something on gender and productive uses of energy, and then about the role of women in the energy supply chain. So next slide. Just very quickly, for those of you who don't know Energia, it's an international network on gender and sustainable energy, which is hosted by HEVOS, an NGO, an international NGO based in the Netherlands. Now, Energia does quite a number of things, but I think one of the things to make clear here is that Energia has been building an evidence base on how that can better inform energy policy and practice on issues linked to, say, the SDGs that we heard about in the introduction. Next slide. The evidence comes from a big piece of research over 5 years that Energia was responsible for. And I think one of the, you can see some of the illustrious team in this, this photograph. You can see the range of countries that we did data gathering in, which were a number both in Africa and in Asia, and we looked at a range of different themes, of which the economic empowerment was one of them. But I think one of the important things to say here is that there were 11,000 interviews conducted through the program. So, so this is very mixed methods. There's some quantitative data and a lot of qualitative data. Next slide. So I'm going to now talk about gender and productive uses of energy. So next slide, can you jump 2 slides, please? Yeah. Now, this is one set of evidence, and I think there's some important take-home messages here. This was from the street food sector. And what we found here, a number of surprising things, but I've only got time to tell you about one, how little difference there was in energy usage, in the types of energy that people use between male and female owned enterprises. So that was, yeah, if you take that and think, okay, well, okay, then yeah, there's no difference. However, if you go to the next slide, so if you go to, yeah, so what we see is, now here's a different set of data. This is data, the previous data was from Ghana. Now we shift to Tanzania and, sorry, the previous slide was from Rwanda. This is for data from Tanzania and Ghana, and we look at a completely different sector. And so what we see there is a very different set of evidence that men are using energy in a different way because they're consuming more electricity than women's enterprises. Women's enterprises tend to be focusing on charcoal, but these are different sectors. So the important thing to, yes, it's okay, go to the next slide. The important thing to take from this is, one, be clear about which sector you're looking at. Don't make assumptions that generalize across all sectors. It will depend on a whole range of things. So I don't have time to talk about this whole slide, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things about it. Men's businesses are generally starting from a much stronger base than women's enterprises. Number of reasons behind this, not all of which are to do with finance, but some of them are. But women seem to be particularly burdened in improving their business position because of the burden of childcare. And that we found across all of our research. It's childcare that holds is one of the major factors holding women back. And men tend to be seen as much better companies for selling your energy to. So the formal energy sector sees men's businesses as better for their businesses. So next slide, please. So what can we do then to achieve more gender equitable outcomes from PUE? Next slide. Is that, well, here's 2 or 3 suggestions. These aren't the only ones. There's lots in the Energia material, which there will be links to on the website after this presentation. I think you certainly have to understand the nature of women's businesses. They're different from men's. They're often located in the household, and and they do use different sources of energy, and electricity may not be their primary source of energy. So it's our appeal is to say, look at the activities women and men currently do and leave no one behind, and focus on appropriate rather than necessarily modern energy services. So don't get too obsessed with electricity. Not that electricity isn't a good energy source, it's not the only one. Next slide. I'm going to now talk about women in the energy supply chain. So next slide. Now, most of the emphasis has been on looking at the small scale, the small end self-help groups, micro energy entrepreneurs. And now I think the next big push will go to bigger scale, to involve women in medium-sized enterprises and in large-scale utilities. They've been doing great work at the bottom end of the scale. So next slide, is to say that what we found is that women make good energy entrepreneurs. They also make good employees. And what comes out of ours is that evidence shows that women are good for business, and it's also business is good for women and their families. It brings big improvements in women's self-confidence, their capacity to make decisions, and also to challenge gender norms. Next slide, please. Now, what this shows is this is very interesting data that comes from a set of randomized controlled trials. First time it's been used in the energy sector. And we looked at the way that women behaved in small scale LED lighting businesses, both when they worked together with a group with men and when they worked on their own, and compared them with men's groups. And one of the things that we find that comes out of this is that how well that this feeds not only to women's confidence, but the way that it affects things in the household. We found that children were spending far more time studying because when their mothers were working. So significant benefits to the household. Now, the next the slide, which comes, this comes, I'm not going to talk about the left-hand side of the slide, but what we find is that there's very little difference between men and women as entrepreneurs. That people on low income are not desperately keen on risk-taking. Losing $1 if you're on a low income is a big loss. If you're a millionaire, if you're Bill Gates, if you lose $1, you probably don't notice. But so this literature often says that women are less risk-taking than men. That's not necessarily the case. We also found in these particular businesses that women were just as competitive as men. But a big thing that came out of this that changed for women was their social status. They were seen as people you could go to advice for in the community. So their whole standing and status changed from being entrepreneurs. Not only their income, not only their kids improved, but the women themselves improved. Next slide. So how can we support women to be energy entrepreneurs? Big question this. I'm not going to go through the entire next set of slides, but I strongly suggest if you're interested in this, look at Energia's Women's Economic Empowerment Program. This data comes from that. This finding comes from that. I would just want to draw attention to 2 bullet points in the left-hand one about what makes a successful entrepreneur. The level of education isn't a deciding factor. And I think that's the key. It's getting women's self-confidence up that you can do this. Being mobile is important, and mobile is not only physical mobility. I think that the mobile phone has changed the whole economic system, and so this women who are more confined to the household can also do more effective business. Next slide. Marketing and distribution are also important. I think this part, keeping the business running, there's lots of good training programs, but how you keep your business going is something that needs attention to. And our big say on this is that although you get a lot about access to finance, very important, but it's not the silver bullet. It needs other things. And my closing remarks on this very fast run through are, next slide. My closing remarks, I've just picked out 3 things that I think are important take home. They're not the only ones out of all those 11,000 interviews we did. Next slide. 4 things, sorry, 4. Hello. I lost my closing remarks. What slide? It's the one with the SDG picture. Slide 40. Yeah. Right, what we found is that certainly women's and energy entrepreneurship is certainly, we find direct links to at least 3 of the SDGs. 1, decent work. 2, reducing income poverty, and also contributing significantly to gender equality. It's good for business, it's good for women. Modern energy services do contribute to women's productive uses of energy, but there is inequality between sectors and position in the value chain. And supporting women to become energy entrepreneurs requires building and strengthening the enable environment and engaging men too. So last slide then is to say thank you to everybody for listening. And this is, I'm not going to read all this out, don't worry. This is thank you to our team who produced all the very valuable evidence. And so thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joy. And before we jump into our next presenter, I just want to remind you that there's a Q&A function on Zoom, which you can use to start typing in your questions, and we will address them at the end of all the presentations. Over to you, Susie.
Well, just firstly, I'd like to start with an apology for being a little later on the call. I think originally my slides were going to come first because it's a bit of an overview of the sector, but I managed to get my time zones confused because the US has changed and the UK hasn't. But I just wanted to apologize to everyone on the call, and particularly to thank Joy for stepping in and presenting the first off. But to go into the next slide, my name's Susie Wheeldon. I'm the research lead at GOGLA. And for those of you who don't know GOGLA, we are an industry association made up of members of the off-grid solar sector, so companies working in the off-grid space, investors focused on the off-grid space, and other sector support organizations. We have about 170 members. And so on the next slide, it's what I just wanted to highlight in advance before I jump into the impacts related to women more particularly, is just that this sector is a very high impact sector, particularly for communities that are quite often in obviously in emerging economies, but obviously relatively poor households in rural areas. So the off-grid solar sector has helped to unlock energy access for millions of people. And the impacts that increased energy, so light and power, and now with the appliances coming in, is helping to support things like enterprise, increasing the amount of time that people can spend working, etc. And on the next slide, we can see, if you could click on, we can see that this translates into commonly more income being able to be generated for some smaller systems, lanterns and solar home systems, savings in relating to expenditure, and where we're replacing traditional products like kerosene lanterns, etc. That's also creating health and safety benefits and reducing carbon and CO2. So if we go on to the next slide, obviously importantly for us, how does this impact women? Moving on again, I think one of the main aspects to highlight is, and perhaps Joy covered this in part, is how energy disproportionately impacts women. And although a while back, in terms of the 2013 stat you'll see on the screen, there were 500 million homes not that long ago using kerosene for lighting. Off-grid solar and other solutions have helped to change that number a little. But these solutions have helped to remove kerosene in particular, which has particularly been damaging for women and children in that they are quite commonly in the home slightly more often. So the ones who would be using these products, therefore more at risk of explosions and fire and burns. Also the toxic fumes that come out of kerosene lanterns, which have very dangerous particulate matter in them, are then breathed in more commonly by women and by children. And so you can see a statistic here in terms of an increase in tuberculosis related to the kerosene lighting. There's also respiratory diseases of different types, eye infections, etc., that you get from the kerosene. And also important to note that where we come to appliances and the potential there, women are predominantly undertaking a lot of agricultural tasks, you know, getting clean water, etc., for agriculture and even for clean water in the home. And so again, there's the potential, if you reduce that energy poverty, to impact women very positively. So if you flick onto the next slide, we can see that we have been, of course, within this sector, reducing the amount of kerosene lamps that there are out there. I clearly haven't put the efficiency content into this slide, but this is all related to the increased efficiencies and improvements in these technologies that have allowed them to proliferate over the last few years. And now what we're seeing emerging, as well as lanterns and solar home systems, and of course pertinent to this conversation, is the emergence of technologies such as solar water pumps and cold storage solutions, which are really then creating another range of impacts for women in terms of clean energy access. If we go on to the next slide, I wanted to share with you a little bit of data around the economic impacts that we've been seeing as it relates to off-grid solar products. And this is from some recent research called Powering Opportunity. And thereby, within this research, we looked very much at this economic activity that was being uncovered by off-grid solar solutions, and found that this additional time in the day and the way that products are being used in enterprises is unlocking a lot of work hours that are being able to be additionally utilized. And so for every 100 solar home systems sold in East Africa, the research found that 21 FTE, so full-time equivalent employment opportunities, were being created, which is really phenomenal findings. What I would caveat this is with two things quite strongly, is that this doesn't mean that we've now got 100 solar home systems and 100 nice full-time jobs that are easily defined. This FTE comes from where you sort of marry time together across a number of different people to create this full-time equivalency. So it represents where you might have a couple of hours additional light in an evening in one household, and someone benefiting from that to undertake more activities such as more agriculture in the day because they've shifted some tasks to the evening. And perhaps maybe also encapsulates people who actually spend their full day working because they have a solar home system, perhaps with, let's say, for example, a TV with it. They've opened a video hall and that's become their business. So this 21 FTEs is, you know, that range of different times that people are spending, and also to recognize these are commonly insecure jobs. And I think Joy touched a little bit on types of jobs for women in her previous presentation, but they're not necessarily secure jobs that we might have in an office, at least here in the UK, but perhaps shops opening for longer, as I say, more time for agriculture and sales and those kind of activities. But nevertheless, this is really phenomenal insight that we found through this research. And what was really exciting in East Africa particularly is we found that 52% of these FTEs were for women. And then when you average that, when you look at the amount of sales of solar home systems in East Africa, which is to date in the last few years up to around 5 million, and that actually then translates to roughly 500,000 FTEs for women being unlocked at the household level by these systems. And we saw great impact also in West Africa, not as high as East Africa, and unfortunately in a way, because it's so fantastic in West Africa, but these 8 FTEs, but it pales against East Africa. But we saw that kind of impact there also in South Asia, but not quite such a high percentage for women. So asking the question, you know, is there more that we can do to understand what's happening in East Africa that could be applied across into West Africa? Although again, sort of highlighting there that I think the 38 and the 52 are slightly more in line with the gender split of employment in those regions, bearing in mind, of course, these regions are not homogenous. They're made up of multiple countries with different percentages. But very exciting to see these impacts being created by off-grid solar, and exciting to see the percentage of women that are being affected. On the next couple of slides, I'll skip through super quickly because they just, I'm hoping these slides will be shared. These provide a couple of examples where women are particularly using their systems to support business. In this instance, a lady in Uganda opening her restaurant for longer and actually benefiting enough to employ 3 other women. And on the next slide, we see an instance where Mboni has now running a video hall using a solar TV. So seeing those appliances also come in to create those kind of opportunities. But quickly before ending, I also wanted to skip on to the next slide and mention, I think really sort of fitting with what Joy was saying, there is more opportunity within the off-grid sector itself to try to encourage more women to be a part of the sector and have very key roles within it. We have around 100,000 women in the off-grid solar sector today, yet only 27% are women. And although that's higher than some of our peer industries, we recognize this is something to be improved upon. And on the last slide I have here, I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that some of the GOGLA members and others are obviously trying to address this challenge. And some of you may already have heard of great initiatives like the Solar Mamas from Barefoot College, Frontier Markets, a distributing organization that particularly works with women through the Solar Saheli scheme, of course, the Solar Sister, where very particularly these organizations are targeting women as sales agents, as engineers, as key members of the management teams, and as being absolutely fundamental to those initiatives and successes. But we're also beginning to see quite a lot of other companies beginning to take action to improve the gender balance within their organizations that haven't had such a strong gender focus before, or been created in such a way. So there's a couple of really exciting challenges and initiatives, including the 2X challenge, which is a wider development challenge where we now see funding coming through to PEG, who have particularly sought to improve the women they have in their business and in leadership. Azuri, aiming for 50% of its workforce being female, and the Energy to Equal challenge by the IFC, which a number of off-grid companies have signed up to increase the participation of women in their organization. So as I say, really exciting to see that there are a lot of women in this sector, and there is a lot of impact being created for women, but absolutely something that I'm excited companies are continuing to focus on and work on to try to improve and enhance. And with that, I'll hand back over to Makena and on to Stephanie with, again, another apology that this should have been a sort of a preceding presentation, but very glad to be here now.
Thanks, Susie. Very interesting insights. And in the interest of time, so we have lots of questions and answers. I'll hand over now to Stephanie.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, and great to hear from both Susie and Joy. I want to just start by sort of saying thanks to everyone, and just to note that our work at Value for Women, I think, is a nice complement to my fellow panelists, as we are looking at gender inclusion in the energy sector from the point of view of investors and SMEs in general, and how they can be incorporating gender inclusion across business models in order to further not only the potential employment opportunities for women amongst their businesses, but also looking at ways that they can better incorporate the needs of women customers. So a slightly different but complementary angle, I think, to my fellow panelists. So just for those that don't know, Value for Women, we are a specialized advisory firm and we work with our partners to help them advance gender inclusion in their organizations. And we can jump to the next slide. We're a global advisory firm. We are a group of consultants that operate to work with our partners to really focus on what we like to say is demystifying gender inclusion across businesses. And we do this by applying very practical solutions and practical pilots to our businesses to test different gender strategies with a focus on business impact. So we really try and look at on where it is that that gender can be most impactful, not only from a social impact standpoint, but also from a business impact standpoint. And we focus on a number of sectors, as you can see here on the slides, but clean energy being amongst those. Next slide, please. So in the clean energy space in particular, we work with a number of different partners, including foundations, multilateral organizations, impact investors, and SMEs, as I mentioned at the outset. And we really do have a focus with our partners on focusing on increasing gender lens investment in this sector, and really also focusing on, in doing that, the opportunities that it can provide for women to gain access to clean energy in various and new ways, as well as influencing the sector to try and find new and innovative ways to incorporate women within businesses, focusing on employment, as well as entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. So we've worked with a number of different partners, as you saw in the previous slide, but just for today's example, I'm going to dive into our partnership with the Shell Foundation. We've had a partnership with Shell for the last 3 years, where we've been working on a pilot together, which was intended to be a small research pilot and has since grown to be a pilot program which has incorporated a number of SMEs in the Shell Foundation portfolio. And we've worked with those Shell Foundation partners to really focus on answering some key questions regarding gender inclusion in the clean energy space. And in particular, we're looking at questions such as, are there opportunities for gender inclusion in clean energy businesses to go beyond just HR or headcount metrics? And so what we mean by that is that we know gender inclusion can often sort of, when we're looking at gender in businesses, it can often kind of get pushed to the side into the HR box, and while it's important that it be there, what we wanted to do was bring it sort of out of that one area of businesses and say, can a business apply gender inclusion practices across the entire business model? And if so, is there data or findings that can help build the business case for gender inclusion if we were to do that? So that's one of the questions we were looking at. And we're also looking to answer questions about what do clean energy businesses in particular need in order to support and further gender inclusion in their work. So really specifically the how, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but what we found is that many investors and SMEs in the space really do have a keen interest in being more gender inclusive from both an employee and customer standpoint, but there's a lot of question, understandably, as to how to practically do that. What does that mean? And how do you do that in addition to just kind of moving, or how do you do that by moving beyond just those headcount metrics I mentioned? And so our work is very practical and very much focused on trying to unpack that how and finding practical strategies for that. And that's what this pilot in particular with the Shell Foundation has been looking at. So we can jump to the next slide. So our approach here, I just wanted to outline what our approach has been with the Shell Foundation work in particular that we've been doing. And again, our approach as an organization, our approach will be customized and will shift depending on the partner that we're working with in this space. But with Shell Foundation, what we've done is sort of develop the 6-step approach to the work that we've carried out. And the first step was really to engage with partners and determine the current level of gender engagement. So across the Shell Foundation portfolio, different businesses have different levels of engagement when it comes to gender inclusion across their business. So some are quite conscious of it, some are quite inclusive, even if it was not necessarily an intentional strategy to be so. Some are curious about gender inclusion, but don't have quite the know-how to be more inclusive. And others are just not as tuned into it, as they're just not quite aware of how it might fit into their business models. So we first engage with partners to try and sort of assess where partners are at in terms of their engagement. And then step 2 is really to assess those partners for opportunities or challenges when it comes to inclusion. So here's where we look at a number of different areas of a business. And so that would be the employees and the leadership, which is a bit of those headcount metrics I referenced. So, do we see inclusion across the business at the employee side or at the senior leadership or decision-making side? Do we see practices and policies? Again, this can fall into the HR area as well, where we say, are there practices and policies that are inclusive, and how is the business, acting on those? And then also looking across the engagement externally with other partners or with customers. So if this is an investor, we sort of look, how do they engage with SMEs? And if it's an SME, we look, how do they engage with their customers? And how is there an intentional gender lens on that engagement or not? And that's where we determine where some interesting opportunities might be. The third step is then to sort of create an opportunity map of these potential strategies. And what we have been really emphasizing in this work is that we've been looking at both social impact strategies and business impact strategies. So while we know that there has been and continues to be a lot of really interesting work on the social impact side of gender inclusion in the clean energy space, we also wanted to know, is there a business impact impact? If we put a gender lens across a call center in a clean energy pay-go business, will we see an impact there? Or if we apply a gender lens to sales strategies for a direct sales force selling household clean energy products, is there a business impact we can build there? We develop out those strategies and we support the businesses in implementing and measuring the impact of those. And we also provide then training and capacity building for partners so that if the pilots are successful that we run, that the pilots can continue and can scale across an organization even after our work has concluded with them. And then finally, we do a pre and post intervention assessment. And so what we'll do here is look at how a business might be thinking about gender in their work at the start of our engagement, and is there a shift at the end of the engagement, and has there been a shift not only in business impact but ideally in the perception? And so is there an understanding of the importance of gender in a way that perhaps it wasn't seen at the outset of the engagement? Next slide, please. And so some of our findings to date, and this is really an aggregate across all of the partnerships we've engaged in, we've got data points that we can share, and those are actually, you can find that on our website. There's an extensive report that we've done with Shell Foundation, which can give you data points on our first pilot with them in this work. And we're in the process right now of collecting data for our expanded phase 2 of this work. So I don't have current data to share, and I think folks on the call might have seen the previous data. So I didn't want to rehash the old data points, and excited to share new data points in the fall when our pilot concludes. But in the meantime, I did want to share some of our overall learnings as it might be applicable to folks on the call. And so the first is, in the clean energy sector as a whole, what we found is that there's a keen awareness of the importance of inclusion, which I know my previous panelists have been speaking to as well. But again, there's this lack of practical know-how, or sort of an opportunity for additional support to be applied to both investors and to SMEs to understand exactly how it is to be inclusive on a very practical level. The second is that the business case for gender inclusion is limited right now, meaning the amount of data that's out there, but it's definitely growing. And we've seen this with our own work as well as work with some of our peers and partners. So continued piloting is needed across the sector. And that includes, not only the ability to kind of carry out pilots to gather this data, but also funding for these type of pilots so that we can all continue to build upon the data that we've been able to start with here. The third is that women's voices are heard, but their influence remains constrained due to traditional roles in many cases in the household. And so what I mean by this is that women customers are heard. Businesses are very keenly aware and growing even more so about the fact that women might be the end user of their products, particularly if we're talking about household energy products, but that men are actually, men of the household are typically still the buyers of the product in many cases. So that can be challenging for a business, as they might want to be engaging men when actually women might actually be their target customer base. And so there's a lot of work that we can be doing there to help businesses sort of unpack that dynamic and find new and interesting ways to engage women and women customers, even if women aren't the household member who actually signs on the dotted line when a product is purchased. And finally, from the employee side, we found repeatedly in our pilots that women tend to be strong, and often cases stronger, in terms of their performance when compared to male peers when we're talking about sales roles of household energy products in particular. But women also face very gender-specific limitations to their employment and their earning potential. And what that means is women often face mobility challenges, transport challenges, security challenges, and other challenges that limit the reach that women sales agents can have. However, when strategies are applied and women are able to sort of meet the same customer reach as their male peers, time and again, we're seeing they outperform as well or outperform their male peers. And so it's quite interesting because it provides an opportunity for businesses to begin to think about what are some specific strategies they can do to engage women sales agents and support women sales sales agent so that they can further their earning potential. And those are the types of strategies we are currently testing right now with our partners.
I'm sorry, Stephanie. I'm gonna have to just give you one last sentence.
Yeah, I'm actually all done. So I think the next slide, the next slide is my wrap up slide. Yep. So that's it. Yeah, you can advance to the next slide, but I think that's all we have. So so thanks very much, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Just in time there. So maybe just a couple of questions from me before we take the questions that are rolling in from the rest of the audience. I'll start with you, Joy. I mean, you've been doing research now on this specific project for the last 5 years. What are you seeing as, the gaps in evidence or the areas for future work as we continue to think about empowering women in the energy access space?
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, I would, a couple of things. First, I was very interested in the about the GOGLA presentation mentioning about appliances, and I think what we are missing is longitudinal data. That most research, or evaluations take place within 6 months of the end of a project, but trying to find people who go back after a much longer period of time is really quite difficult. I was quite shocked to find that it's assumed that health improves with improved cook stoves, but nobody actually seems to go back and do the measurements to check whether that really does happen. So I think there's a need for lots of longitudinal data to see what change, if any, actually occurs. And I think it is interesting. I think one of the areas, a lot of the work has actually been done in the South, in what we may call developing countries. And I think actually an area where there's a lot missing is actually what's happening in the North, in industrialized countries. Research we did recently for the European Union found women cooking with fuel wood. And I mean, that's taking some difficulty getting that type of message through. And also, I would say that it isn't easy to get women into the supply chain, into the more technical areas. I just had it pointed out to me that one of the leading countries in wind energy is Denmark, and I think that's a country we would associate with gender equality, or very good gender equality, yet there are relatively few women working in engineering positions in the wind energy sector in Denmark. Why? We don't know. And I think there's lots of interesting questions, both on the use side and on getting women higher up into the energy chain. So those are things that I would take as areas for interest.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, we absolutely at the coalition share this the need for longitudinal data in the sector, and just kind of jumping off that observation you've made about women in jobs. A question for you, Susie. From the Powering Jobs initiative, what have you learned that would help the private sector or policymakers or even donors boost the share of women in energy jobs?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I guess at the sector level, we're beginning to see some really helpful initiatives. As I mentioned, the Equal Energy to Equal from the IFC, where it's trying to create a sort of a hub for organizations focused on that, and particularly as it relates to the CDC example for PEG. I mean, there's a big carrot when there's a good investment opportunity within your company if you focus more on gender. So certainly I think some of the research and data that comes through studies such as Stephanie's and Joy's, where you can actually see the benefits of involving women, and I think GOGLA has a role to play in making sure that those benefits are well understood by our members, so that they would see a business case in any case for encouraging more women into the sector and encouraging them to be part of their organization. But I also see that there's additional carrots that public sector and perhaps governments can play in providing sort of additional finance or lower interest rated finance or something along those lines for companies that particularly do address this issue very strongly and operate highly in relation to women. So I think it's a bit of a mixture. I mean, companies in any case, many of which have already got strong female leadership, are quite active in this space. But I certainly think where we're hearing that it's really great for the bottom line. It's always easier then for companies to move in that direction when they're quite stretched otherwise.
Thanks for those perspectives, Susie. This then really takes me to you, Stephanie, and you've done a lot of work kind of making the business case or helping companies to understand the business case for gender inclusion. And I'm just wondering, what can the off-grid sector learn from other sectors that have applied kind of gender inclusion efforts, or other companies that you've worked with?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, we've worked with other sector, done this work with folks in the ag sector and access to finance and other areas outside of clean energy. And I think what we've found is that there's one common denominator in all of this, and that is data. And it might sound a little obvious to say, but the reality is most businesses that we've been working with have a tremendous amount of data, sex disaggregated data, or they could quite easily sex disaggregate their current data and use that data to learn a lot about both their employees and their customers and different trends and find different opportunities for further inclusion there. I think the question, or sort of the challenge is, many of the businesses we work with will see that they have this data, but they're not quite sure how to action it and how to put it into practical work, for themselves to help them become more inclusive. And so I think that's where organizations, like Value for Women, Energia, and other folks can really step in and sort of help these SMEs sort of understand what that data means and how to translate that into practical action for themselves.
That's fantastic. Again, a call there for data and just the power that has in kind of making that case for more gender inclusion. I want to now jump into the audience Q&A. We've got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to try and do this in the order, a little bit in the order that they were asked, and skipping around to make sure we get to hear different perspectives. In terms of if there are any resources that are available, we will share resources at the end of the webinar. And I'm sure in the websites of any of our panelists, you'll also find quite a lot of resources about how to kind of integrate gender or to think about gender. And then we have another question here. What are your thoughts on ways we can support more women globally to climb up energy access tiers after they've moved into tier 1? And I think maybe I will direct this to Susie, and then anyone else on the panel who would like to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a challenge, a really exciting challenge in any case, to move, regardless of gender, people from tier 1 up to the higher tiers of energy access. And we're beginning to see this trend quite a lot now, where people are a little bit more used to the off-grid solar technology, at least from our part of the energy access space, and therefore feel more comfortable to invest in larger product sizes. And actually we find that there's certain data that seems to suggest that women are actually often better long-term payers in terms of energy access, so therefore perhaps more likely, or in some cases, to be able to be offered new and slightly larger products and services. So that's really encouraging as something to explore a little bit more. So I think on one side, if that kind of data can be validated and showcased, I think that would help off-grid solar companies to focus even more on women and moving them up along their energy journey. And then I think from a wider support side of things, one thing that we would love to learn more about, and perhaps working with partners such as Energia, and then those that dig into the data even further than we do in terms, we sort of map out what's happening and disaggregate data, as Stephanie just mentioned, but we haven't dug into the data too much with the gender lens in terms of what more we can do. I think that's a very interesting next step to sort of look at those women who are moving up that energy staircase, try to understand how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what enabling factors are helping that. And equally, to unpick some of those restrictions where that isn't happening, training and delve into that a bit more. It's not something I'm afraid that we've done at the moment, but I see a real opportunity on that, and I do see an exciting early evidence that women are in fact very, slightly more consistent in terms of their payments, and plan potentially a little bit better in terms of those. So might be then attractive and indeed the kinds of customers you want to support along that energy journey. So I think, yeah, there's more that companies can do to perhaps focus on women, but I think there's perhaps also more understanding we need in terms of what other steps we could take to make sure that is being prioritized.
Thanks, Susie. That's really comprehensive. Maybe then I can move to Stephanie. A question for you here from Deborah Di Cavallo. What are the main topics for the energy training benefiting SMEs? Any idea for the topics targeting policymakers or enabling environment for off-grid?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is the question asking what are the best topics to sort of speak to those businesses about, or what are the most impactful?
I'm gonna assume, because it says main topics, but I'm gonna assume like what are the things that you would, when you're going to gender training for SMEs, what are the topics that would most benefit the SMEs?
Yeah, so I think there's what we like to do is really try and take a sort of a 360 approach to this, meaning that we want to try and engage a business all around. And so while we do want to, when we go to speak to a business, we want to speak about the importance of inclusion at senior level, and decision maker level. That's obviously very important. But we also want to make sure that that businesses can understand and see the impact and the benefit of engaging women sort of throughout their business operations. And I'll give one example that I think will sort of piggyback on what Susie was just speaking about. But we're currently running one pilot with an SME and looking at the repayment rates of their customers, and we're utilizing their call center to do this. And so what we found through the process is that women are repeatedly better paying customers over and over again in every category that they look at. But that women are actually only 8% of the customer base. And so there's right there, it's not shocking given the data we've looked at today, but there's a big delta there, which also is a really big opportunity for that business to find ways to engage, to better engage women customers, right? And so I say that because that's the kind of thing that we would demonstrate during a training to an SME. That's the kind of thing we would bring to them and say, this is some interesting data from someone else in the sector that's seeing this opportunity. Perhaps there's an opportunity for you to be looking at your data or looking at your call center or looking at your repayment stats in the same way. So I think the best way to be training businesses is to not only sort of come in and say, let's talk about senior level decision makers and ensuring that we have the right policies in place, but also really engaging them in the business case where we have data to support it, because that can make folks who aren't maybe as prone to be interested in gender or not really see where it might fit into their day-to-day operations, might make them sit up and take notice a bit more when they actually see that there's a practical business impact that can be applied to their work.
Fantastic. I think there's sorry, I'm just having a little bit of pop-ups appearing for me. So I think that's really interesting to hear kind of all these potential techniques that companies could use. And then I want to just move it on to Joy. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. Can you give more examples of what appropriate rather than necessary modern energy services are? And I think also one that I think would be a great one for you is also, could we speak more about the norms, the gender norms, and how those are affecting kind of women empowerment in the access space?
Okay, oh gosh, that's two. On appropriate energy, I was just thinking about this actually, that a lot of women's existing businesses, so this is the things that women are doing now and not what they potentially might move into, rely on process heat. And also on their own physical body. So you would think of appropriateness there would be some sort of mechanical device. which may not necessarily run on electricity. And lots of bits of equipment, of modern equipment, really requires grid electricity. So off-grid, small scale, I mean, you could have mini grids, but small scale, say, solar home systems is not big enough to power some of the more modern productive uses of productive equipment. So I think you have to think in those terms. Also, process heat, particularly, say, cooking. Electricity is not always the cheapest way of cooking, so women will still use fuel wood for a whole range, or charcoal, depending on where you are, for those sorts of things. Now, and the second question was, sorry, it was a slightly different issue. Sorry.
So the second one was about the norms. So the
norms, yes,
yeah,
and that's also what I was thinking about. What you would tell people who would, sort of trying to train entrepreneurs. Norms affect what we perceive is the right thing to do, or the right sort of behavior, the right sort of jobs, and it's creating the space to show that women can do things. So the evidence from Kenya that we showed was that by actually convincing a number of male leaders in a community that let women have a go, let's see what they can do. And so, the male leader said, oh, well, okay, all right. And the women went off to learn how to be solar home system engineers. They came back to their village, were shown climbing over roofs, up poles, and people, both men and women in the village, were astonished to see, well, yeah, women can do this. So there are prejudices that come from norms that prevent often women, and also there are examples of men doing particular things. So I think, and what I would also say in this case, going back to what we were just talking about entrepreneurs, is also perceptions about what we think women and men, the roles of women and men do, and who takes decisions in the household, for example. I was just at a presentation where there was a colleague from Value for Women, and she really took the guide to this man who was talking about marketing and saying that, yeah, you marketed towards the woman of the household and not the man. And she pointed out, just as you have done, that actually it's men who still take the decisions, the final decision over many, including cook stoves for the household. Often when people say they do joint decision making, at the end of the day, it's the man. And I think it's being understanding what those norms do, how they can limit, but they can change. I mean, norms do change over time. And we only all have to think back to what our grandmothers or grandfathers would say to us, as oh, girls didn't do that when I was your age, and boys didn't do that when I was your age. So things do change, and we can help them change faster. And by being aware of them and looking at ways that we can encourage them to change. So that's, I mean, normally I get sort of 2 hours to talk. So that's a quick summary. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. And really also born by our research, where we see that the kind of consumer messaging really does affect that decision to purchase, but even who kind of sees and is aware, right, of their plans when we've done research on that. So maybe kicking back to you, Susie, we have a question here. How do you define women's drudgery? So how do you measure and define this in your research?
Oh gosh, I have to confess that's not something that we did within this piece of research, and I'd actually sort of lean more on Joy and the Energia team in terms of experience around measuring drudgery and really, looking into that particular challenge. We recognize it very much, particularly as it pertains to, as I mentioned briefly, it pertains to perhaps sort of some of the chores that are associated with the lack of energy, carrying water, taking longer to undertake household chores because there is no light available. We also recognize there is the potential flip side of having more light and power available in the home, is that can lead in some cases to additional time spent on tasks that could be seen as sort of drudgery. So we recognize that whilst by and large there's a really significant positive impact for women as a result of energy access, we do need to be mindful of the potential for some negatives as well. But I probably would have to bow to the wisdom of Joy on that one.
Joy,
right.
any?
I was waiting for you to tell me how to do it. Okay. Well, yes, how to measure drudgery. I mean, I think, yeah, I would say look at the repetition of particular tasks, and yeah, if you see, say, if you're familiar from West Africa, of preparing cassava, and you see, you know, sort of people or women having to pound the cassava, I don't think you really need to measure the metabolic energy being used there. I think you can say, well, okay, yeah, visually this looks hard work, but how many times do you have to do this a week? And if you can reduce that or eliminate it altogether with a different type of process, then I think that then you can say that you have reduced drudgery. Going to collect water 3 or 4 times a day, I don't think I need, again, I wouldn't feel the need to measure the metabolic energy. I would just know that if I stop women having to go 4 times a day to the well, then I would have reduced their drudgery. So I mean, it depends on who you are, of course. If you are, of course, you know, sort of a human biologist, the answer to the quantity of metabolic energy might be a really interesting topic. But in terms of practicality of, say, advising GOGLA members, I wouldn't see that would be a necessity. I would just say that the reduction in the number of times that you have to do very repetitive and what is visually strenuous tasks. So that's my answer. I hope it satisfied the person who asked the question.
I hope so too, and if not, I guess we can have some follow-ups or an email. If any of your questions aren't answered, please. We will follow up with email, and we'll put them to the panelists by email. So one here that is a bit more general, so I'll leave it for any of you in the panel to answer. Is there research that has been done on the topic of, you know, appliances of empowering, in particular, gender equity in terms of women as the target customers of businesses that are providing productive use appliances? What do women want? What will allow them to increase their incomes? You know, are there any surveys of this type specific to East Africa? Anyone in the panel aware of any research on this topic? I mean, from our point of view, maybe I can just start to answer this question from Marianne Wolpert. We are not aware of much research that has been done, especially with the focus of East Africa, around the intersection of appliances and women. We are really thinking hard and potentially scoping some work out with partners on really digging deep actually into what women need to be able to purchase, to be able to use, to be able to gain impact from appliances. And we hope that we can attract funding to do this type of work, because we understand that it's, you know, it's vital really. The differences between what women want, how they use it, versus what women want and how they use it, and the impact we've seen from our panelists, research, and elsewhere. So we know it's crucial, but I'm not aware of any research that's this specific. I wonder if our panelists have.
This is Joy. I can't remember the exact details, but certainly the within the Energia research program, the team that looked at the street food sector, they found that both male and female in street food sector entrepreneurs had very good ideas about what they wanted. They had good ideas, and of course this is also linked to, and I talk about perceptions, that of course most of these people are working in the informal sector, and there is a tendency, certainly in the sort of business economic literature, to assume that the informal sector people are subsistence enterprises and have no interest in growth. And that certainly was not what we found. That the entrepreneurs had very strong ideas about how they would like to see their business grow. They wanted their businesses to grow. And this is both women and men as entrepreneurs, and they had very strong ideas about what type of energy uses that they would like to see. So that would also include the types of equipment that they would like. I'm sorry I can't give you the details of exactly what, but if you're really interested, you could look on the Energia website for the research team that did the street food sector.
Yeah, from the GOGLA side of things, it's nothing that springs to mind, McKenna, and indeed Marianne. I think it is a really interesting area to explore more, and I think we have a little insight into kind of the types of appliances that people perhaps are interested in, that can be disaggregated by gender, and perhaps something we could quite easily do, but we haven't really dug into that to understand those motivations more, to understand in detail in terms of the if we might have asked a question around particular appliances, but exactly what kind of appliance that customer might mean versus what we might perceive them to mean. And I think that perhaps it would be interesting to look at through the lens of then perhaps the challenges that customers, particularly women, might face in accessing those products and services if those exist. I know we've talked a little bit about on this in this presentation and webinar around decision making, where in some households women may not have as much decision-making power. Perhaps there might be some households where the economic power is not so strong. So I think a very interesting area to look more into. And yeah, I wonder perhaps even on top of that, perhaps also to team it with looking at perhaps some of those challenges, as well as with obviously with the focus on how to overcome them.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of questions coming up on the idea of anyone has done certain types of research into, the appliances really and the gender angles, but also any research about how to get women, or what kind of messaging is needed to get women to purchase more appliances. So I think the consensus we're all drawing is that there's just not enough data and research being done on this kind of more specific questions, and there's that need out there in the sector, really. Wanting to hear now from Stephanie. So Sasmita asks, how do we convince governments to generate gender disaggregated data or evidence on women's specific impact in non-traditional industries like energy? Have you had any experience with policymakers on gender inclusion?
So we don't work directly with policymakers, or we really do stay focused on the business case. But I think that I don't want to be repeating myself, but I do think the way to influence and to get people to sit up and pay attention who might not otherwise when it comes to a topic like gender is back to the business case, right, and back to the data. So I think the best way to do that is to sort of take the data that does exist out there that shows that there is a business case for this in different areas, and use that as a jumping off point for larger conversations, right? So even if, and I'm happy to point everyone to the first paper that I mentioned that we've published with Shell Foundation, which is on our website. It has some interesting data points about pilots we've run with businesses that do show, and again, those pilots were quite small, but they show directionally some really interesting and promising data about the business case for including women across clean energy SMEs. I think if we can take data like that, even at a small scale, and then begin to use that as a jumping point to develop out further studies and build out a larger data case. I think that really is what people at a policy level will start to sort of see and sit up and pay attention to. At the end of the day, if you can say that that gender inclusion is going to move the needle in terms of either impact on women, or impact on a business, and hopefully you'll be able to say both, then it becomes harder and harder for policymakers to ignore that. So, folks like Energia, and, are doing great research in this area, and Value for Women's working to kind of apply that research in a practical way. So yeah, that would be my best piece of guidance when it comes to influencing policy is, let's get some more data, and use that business case.
Can I add to that? It's Joy. Can I just add to that? Actually, there is some good news on this front, because on reporting for the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes the energy goal and the gender goal, governments are required to produce gender disaggregated data. So, okay, in some ways this is rather limited by the indicators within those SDGs, but hopefully once, as Stephanie says, once governments begin to realise the value of this type of data and how it gives them better policy delivery, then it will spread across over a much broader horizon.
Thanks, Joy. And I think that's really interesting to hear that there is some movement being done, at least on tracking and gathering some evidence that might influence policymakers. Maybe let's switch focus now to money and funding. So Shanta asks, it seems that most of the private sector funding in this space is still dominated by men who often have the networks. Is anyone tracking where the money is going and how we influence this investment space? Perhaps, can I throw that to you, Susie? Since
I knew you would pick Henry. No, that's totally fine. But actually, it's a fantastic question, and I have to confess I don't know the answer. I mean, I know there are a couple of organizations such as Acumen with very strong female leads, very strong female team or members of the team there, who particularly focused on energy access in the investment space. But I do recognize the statement there that obviously investment is very can be quite male more commonly, and so no, we haven't done it, but it's a very interesting question, and I think something that would be good to look into. And I think obviously from the off-grid solar side of things, we are seeing sort of investment or initiatives that are supporting companies where they have an increase in female participation and increase in women in leadership. But I'm not sure if that lens has been gone back towards the investors themselves, and other organizations to have that look. So I'm afraid it's a no in terms of any knowledge, but a very interesting question and something that I'll probably mull over a little bit. Interesting.
Yeah, maybe I'll open it up to Stephanie and Joy if you have any ideas. I mean, a follow on really on that is, how do you fund the smaller women-led startups, for example? How do we get traditional donors to look at that space?
Yeah, I can jump in just for a moment. It's Stephanie. Yeah, I think it's again a really good question, and I think I think there are folks that are funding women in the women-led businesses and women in smaller spaces. I think the more that we see that, the more it'll sort of cause a ripple effect, right? And so I think, as Susie referenced, I know Acumen is one of the organizations that's doing this, and there are other investors that we've worked with that are keenly involved in and aware of the need to support women investors. I think a lot women in the investment space. I think a lot of what needs to be done is not only looking at what women's needs are from investors, but also looking at the ecosystem around women entrepreneurs, and what it comes from both sides, right? What is it that that investors should be looking for, and how can investors be helping women-led businesses in this space? But also, what do women need in order to be investment ready? already, right? And so, and that's a lot of support that other actors in the ecosystem can be providing to women to get them to that point. So, so I think it's back to kind of this holistic approach for this particular question. But yeah, much like Susie said, I think there's a big opportunity here and a lot of work to be done in this space. And I think it's being led by a few really innovative impact investors right now, and hoping to see more as the data continues to point to this being a smart investment.
That's great. I mean, keeping the focus a little bit on the companies, and specific to GOGLA, Zoe asks, what is GOGLA doing to encourage organizations in the off-grid sector to move forward with a gender-centric approach in all areas, including employment?
Yeah, so as an industry association, it's certainly something that we support ourselves. We have a majority female board. We have a president of our board who is female. And as I say, many companies are taking this on. As in terms of how the companies operate, we sort of propose and share information with them. They make their own business decisions. And so certainly from the GOGLA side of things, in terms of our communications and in terms of the sharing of insights as they become available to us, we use our networks and channels to do that and encourage companies, in as much as we recommend that that's information that they should act on and take part of. And we're certainly very happy to support this theme and this action to try and encourage companies to take a more gender-centric approach. But those actual decisions, of course, lie within those companies themselves. And so that's where it's so great that we see data upcoming from initiatives such as Value for Women and obviously all the work that Energia have been doing that help us to share information that does spark the interest of companies. And hopefully in the coming sort of months and years, we will be taking some other work with Energia in particular around energy access, and particularly targeting more remote and vulnerable communities, and perhaps making sure that women and gender is central to that theme, and that might provide us with more opportunities to make sure that our companies are learning and hearing from the data and the insights that are coming through.
That's fantastic.
This Joy, I was just going to add that there are assessments that you can do. You can do an organizational assessment which looks at both internal policy of recruitment, but also ways of working. And one of the things that we found in our research is that if an energy organization is sending somebody, say, to a remote area, then it's generally a man. And then men speak to men. And in some cultures, it's actually difficult for a man to enter a household where he's not a family member. So women don't get involved either from the energy utility or as a potential consumer. So I think by doing this kind of assessment of way of working is also very helpful in changing the sorts of perceptions that we all carry. And I'm seeing that I'm being told to be quiet. Okay.
Okay, we only have 4 minutes now until we should move to a wrap-up session. I'm gonna direct one question to Stephanie because I see it recurring, and then one to all the panels with quick responses. So Stephanie, a lot of people are interested in some of the companies you've worked with, any evidence, any pilots or results you could share from any of those pilots you've done. And then a very specific one about how, sorry, just lost it here for a second, about when you say that you're working with women who have limited ability in making spending decisions, and can you offer any examples or speak about that? So I think people are just looking to you for a couple of examples of things that have worked from the companies that you've worked with.
Sure. And again, I'll speak quickly because I know we've just got a few moments here, and then point everybody to the report that we did with Shell Foundation, which you can find on our website, which has a lot more information, and there's 5 or 6 case studies in there, which has specific data for you all. It's called the Business First Approach to Gender Inclusion. You can just search on our site for that. But I'll pull one interesting example from that pilot that we did, and again, we're building on and looking to roll out more data later this year from our continued work with Shell Foundation. But one pilot that we did was we looked at we worked with a clean energy business in India that was selling household products to women. And what they had both male and female sales agents. And what they found was that their women sales agents were not performing as well as their male sales agents, and they couldn't quite understand why. And we unpacked a lot of their data and spent some time with their team and really looked at the different challenges that women were facing that were very specific to gender. And we found a number of things. I mean, again, that report will kind of get into more detail, but one of the things we found was that the company was actually providing demo kits for their sales agents so that they could, use brand new products when they go out to sell. The challenge was that the demo kits had to be purchased, and most of the male agents had the cash, to be able to purchase those demo kits to use in their sales process, and most of the women agents actually didn't. And so we ran a pilot where the business was actually subsidizing that and was providing the demo kits to women agents for free to see if that made a difference. And what they found was it made a difference. I don't want to misquote my data. I don't have it right in front of me, but it was upwards of over 70 in the pilot we ran. It was over 70% increase in terms of the sales that women agents were able to achieve using the demo kit. And so the ROI on that was quite positive for the business. Just the relatively small investment of the demo kits actually turned into incredibly increased sales for women agents. And they also found that during that time, women agents were actually able to sell more frequently than men. So they sold at a higher efficient rate than their male peers. And so again, a smaller investment from the business up front and turned into a very significant return for them. And now that's a practice they've scaled across their organization. So that's one concrete example I can give. And again, that exact data point, don't quote me on it, but it's in that report of ours. But that's one very specific example of a way that we looked at a business challenge through a gender lens and then applied a gender specific solution, piloted it for a certain amount of time, and with the business's ability to sort of put up that capital. And when that was done, it was really a win-win for both the business and the women agents that they were employing.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I want to do a quick one sentence response. As women in the sector, what do you hope to see the landscape look like in 5 or 10 years' time? I'll start with you, Joy, then go to Susie, and then Stephanie.
More women involved and more men taking a gender-sensitive approach.
Fantastic.
I'd say I'd like to see some of these efforts to create equality amongst the off-grid sector really come to fruition. So yeah, seeing us move from that 27 up to 50.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I'd like to see, I'd like to see the practice of inclusion, normalized across businesses so that it's not seen as an exception, but it's just more of the norm.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for all your questions. We are going to try and respond to the ones that we didn't via email, so hold us to that. Next slide, please, Lauren. So just to wrap up, we want to share this exciting bit of, pledge, asking you to do something this time for gender inclusion and kind of female empowerment. So we're launching the Empowering Access Pledge in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, which was the first really comprehensive blueprint about gender mainstreaming as an integrated practice within policy and decision making. So for this pledge, what we are asking our partners and our members and anyone in the energy access community to signal their commitment to either establishing, maintaining, or advancing gender mainstreaming within their work. Signing the pledge would really represent an informal commitment towards mainstreaming gender equality within your organization's culture and its processes. We have a link that will come together with this slide pack, which has a short form just kind of to make that pledge or to reaffirm your commitment. And I think hot off the heels of International Women's Day, it's kind of us reaffirming what we believe to be true and what we believe is convincing and is good for the sector. It's quite, it's great. I will also, if you have any questions, please email us at class. There's an email at the bottom, Joni Coca. Respond to any questions about the pledge. So what remains is for me to kind of let you know that we have a poll at the end of the webinar. So please respond to this poll. I forgot there's also a bunch of resources that you can tap into, some of which have been discussed in the webinar and some of which haven't. So please see that when we circulate the slides. Please respond to the poll. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists, great insights and just fantastic discussion all through. Thanks a lot, everyone.